And I'm not going to talk much. I'm going to pass over to Sheila Patel, who has been a big inspiration in my work. She's the founder of Spark and has done so much work with communities throughout her career. She's an ambassador for the Race to Resilience and about 100 other things. And she's just got so much energy, enthusiasm, and authenticity that we'll bring to this panel. So Sheila, over to you, please.
Thank you, Nate. These chairs are made for tall people. So first of all, thank you, Nate, and thank you, all of you, for allowing somebody like me, who always sits on the other end of a long table talking to business leaders. As you all know, I'm a social activist. I live in Mumbai. And I think there was a special reason why they decided to make me the anchor, because I'm supposed to ask you very difficult questions after the end of your presentations. But I think that this is a very important signal to all of us, because it reflects the reality that all of us, regardless of where we are from and what we do, we have to come from whichever point in the continuum we are, north, south, east, west, wealthy, very poor. We have to come together at some point to transform what we do that works for us and that really works to transform our planet. So it takes me great pleasure to first invite you, Craig, to speak about what you do in the business of investing. You work in many different geographies. You're committed to working on a range of things from environment to health and other things. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here with you. Nice to see you as a moderator, I agree. And Nate, thanks for all you do, and it's wonderful to be at the Conduit at this great venue. Let me be brief, because I want to give you a couple of examples to get a sense of what we do. I've been investing in my firm Pegasus in climate change. We used to call it energy volatility, resource scarcity. Our investors weren't able to think we could invest in climate change, or there might even be an issue, but we've been investing since the early 2000s in climate change, mitigation and adaptation, as well as health and wellness, and often as in the area of food where they intersect. Increasingly, our focus has turned to the global south, which, as we all know, when we speak about vulnerability, it's the front lines of climate, and particularly the most vulnerable populations in those geographies. We're the largest and first accredited private entity, the private equity firm by the Green Climate Fund. We have a number of projects and products with them. In everything we do, even if we're doing mitigation, we think about resilience. We're doing a solar with storage in the Dominican Republic project. It's not about the fact that the Dominican Republic's an emitter. They need to be fossil fuel free, to deal with climate disasters, to not be captive to oil pricing and the like. We look at climate change investing as about giving people food security, energy security, and ultimately working with the community. It's economic development at its core, and ultimately needs to reach the most vulnerable members of the community. So in every project, we work not only with the local governments, the national governments, but also with local stakeholders in developing a project. Let me give you two examples. One is a project which Nate is fond of. We've talked about, and it's with a company in Mali and Senegal growing fonio. How many people in the room know what fonio is or have ever had it? So fonio is an indigenous West African crop, which is drought resistant. It's a grain, about the size of couscous. When the French came to West Africa, they basically stopped people growing it, but it can just be seeded by women farmers for supplemental income. Typically, they're taking shea butter and doing other crops, but you need no pesticide, no added irrigation, and no fertilizer, and it will grow. It's much more nutritious than white rice, and it's extremely resilient. So we're working, first of all, to provide local food security and add supplemental income for the farmers, working on getting people to not be so dependent on white rice imported from other places, and which doesn't have nutrition, and then working on developing an export market, which we're really excited about. And there's a technology element because with a wonderful Swiss company, we're going to be able to process ammonia much faster, which brings the price down. Because now it's hand processed and cleaned, it will bring the price to a point where you can actually be lower than rice, which is really exciting. And we're going to be announcing that. So secondly, real fast to give you a sense, on our ocean side, we're working with sargassum, which many of you will know is the sargassum explosion with fertilizer and heat. Fertilizer flows into the ocean. We have sargassum blooms. It's a disaster economically. It's a disaster from a health standpoint to the communities. And it's a disaster for coral. So we've invested in a company, and we're about to invest in another one, collecting sargassum, intercepting it, and then trying to turn it into a value-add product, starting with originally emulsions into beauty products, but ultimately trying to do things, textiles and the like. And so there are, I think, lots of solutions. And the key is, so there we need locals to collect. We need them to engage and see it's for their interests. So I could go on about other projects, but that gives you a quick sense.
Thank you so much. Before I turn over to you, Anika, I just want to say that being a disruptor, I'm going to flip the strategy of questions. Usually all of us are given very profound questions to ask all of them. But I think this audience can do better. So I'm going to, oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you. I'm going to reverse the order of the questions after all of you speak. So all of you be ready with your questions so that after they speak, you get a chance to ask the questions first. And then whatever you don't ask and I think I want to ask, I will do that. So over to you, Anika. Your work requires you to work on issues of partnerships, and I want to know how you turn people who are competitive into partners.
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me here. I work with governments and private sector companies around the world to help them to become more resilient. And usually when we start the talk, they say, well, we don't need help, actually, we are very well prepared. And I mean, they are not, because we see the climate disasters happening around the world. Just a 100-year flood happened in 2021 in Germany, and the region was completely devastated. This is why HR planning is so important, and the UN climate champions call for action there. Because HR planning needs to happen on national, regional, local level, and also, of course, include the private sector. And it needs to be done in an integrated and localized way and in an inclusive way to include community and minority groups. And climate disasters show that we need to act in a joint way, because they don't care if the disaster happens. The flooding doesn't differentiate between a company or a government or a community. It just devastates everything. And if you look at the numbers, we have to say we're not really prepared yet. Only 30 countries, 45 countries, 30% of developing countries turned in national adaptation plans to the UNFCCC. And if you look at private sector, you can look at CDP, which is a bit of a proxy. 7,000 disclosures happened, and only around 2,700 talk about physical risks. So we see there's still some way to go. Private-public partnerships can help a lot, because we all need to work together, but there are quite a few requirements that we need to look at. We need to really define a common goal and a common ambition we want to work with. So all the different AR measures can align to it. And of course, we need to work on trust and transparency, because no private sector company wants to reveal the risk exposure and vulnerability they have. So we really need to work on platforms that provide, or help to provide trust and transparency. And in the end, we need to set incentives that institutions engage, and that there's a win-win situation for both sides. And there are a lot of global examples around the world, science-based target initiative, CDP, but also wonderful examples on the local level. For example, after the flood hit the wine region in Germany and devastated it completely, the stakeholders communes, private people, but also companies decided to found an innovation agency that should help them to work on innovative solutions and help them to make it market ready. And I thought that was really cool that they aligned behind that goal together and decided to form this agency, because then it's a bit institutionalized and it can help to support the process, yeah, to become more resilient in that region.
Thank you. Down to you, Nigel. You work in Climate Company?
Sheila, can you just because we've got the...
I'm so used to my loud voice. Okay. And you have a long history of working on climate litigation, I'm told. So first of all, explain how a legal practice gets deeply involved in climate. Mm-hmm. And how do you see the outcomes of your work in producing collaborations, in helping set standards, and all the things that we need in the climate space that everybody, like she says, they already think they do, mm-hmm. but we know that they don't.
Yeah. Good questions. We've been heavily involved in climate litigation for about 5 or 6 years, and this field has exploded. There's about 2,200 climate cases to date, and 2/3 of those have been filed since the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015. So it really has taken off, and it's evolving. There's new kinds of climate litigation coming about. Human rights-based litigation, for example, is becoming very prevalent in Europe. In terms of today's agenda, yeah, how can this bring about change? So what we've found, discussions with clients, with corporate clients, is the raising awareness of the duties of care. The existing ones and the emerging ones can really be helpful. That there are, first of all, we've been saying to directors, there are existing duties of care that relate to climate. There's this old view that all that matters is the bottom line, and that has never been the case under English law. It's not the case under lots of other laws either. It never has been. It's become this view in the last 50 years, the Chicago Business School view of the world. But you would be failing in your duty as a director if you perform that way. And under English law, there's an explicit duty to take account of long-term factors and to take account of the environment. We've seen Shell, for example, forced in the Netherlands, it's been ordered to cut its emissions by 45% by 2030. That's based on human rights and other duties. So these are new threats to companies that are failing to do the right thing. And the regulators, where people in the regulated industry, insurers, banks, they are being told to do the right thing. But the law tells them to do this anyway. Just one example for adaptation. USA, you're probably aware there's been huge wildfires until the weather suddenly switched and they had rain, biblical amounts of rain, but they'd had the longest sustained drought for 1,200 years. The PG&E supplied electricity in the north of the state, and their equipment was responsible for a number of major fires back in 2017. Property insurers paid out. You've got Silicon Valley properties being burned down. They paid out billions, turned to PG&E, said compensate us. They went bankrupt. That gave rise to a claim against the directors, and the victims of the fire said you owed a duty of care to the company to adapt your operations. You could see the threat was increasing, but you didn't actually maintain equipment, cut back vegetation and so on. And they paid $117 million in damages last year to settle that case. So we are going to see more of this. If you fail to do the right thing, then you will get caught out. So if we're hearing the advantages, the opportunities of getting involved in improving resilience. There's also, if you're a backmarker, there's a threat of being held liable for failing to do the right thing.
So there's the carrot and the stick.
Yes. This is the stick.
So Svenja, you're next. As a professor and both as a practitioner, how do you see insurance, litigation, and this whole challenge of dealing with very vulnerable communities? Because everywhere I've gone, people say, now rich people also face the consequences of floods, of fires. And the poor are treated as, they always had to face it, but now the rich face it, so now we should do it for everybody. And I feel deeply offended by that. And how do we change this narrative, in your opinion?
Well, thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, I feel, this is the topic closest to my heart, resilience. I've been coming a long way. As a school kid, I did an internship with Greenpeace and did some volunteering after that in Kenya and Fiji. And in Kenya and Fiji, there was, it's a long time ago, I'm not that young anymore, but, there was already sort of this question of, what the future is going to look like. And there were already struggles around water and so on. So I then started working in the insurance sector, which a lot of people might find surprising. And I think what I really brought into this mix and what made me sort of wanting to work in the insurance sector is this notion, insurance is yes, it's a financial tool, but with it comes a lot of risk knowledge, risk management. And if we use it correctly, it can really set in motion a lot of resilience building. I say can because it doesn't always do that. And, this is kind of, since last year, I have joined Marsh McLennan, and I work a lot with our brokers, also with underwriters, to really try and unlock this question of, what's actually the insurance model of the future? Because, if you just think about the next 12 months, and then think, well, if it gets too bad, we just exit a market, as we see in some parts of the world now. Is that a long-term insurance? Is that a long-term business model? No, it isn't. So Marsh McLennan has also started to sponsor Race to Resilience, and I think the idea is really to make resilience center stage and not say, oh, I have insurance, therefore I am resilient. So that's one part of the story. You asked about most vulnerable communities, and I think this is fundamental. I mean, I was once accused at a UN talk. I was asked to talk about climate risk management. So I talked about climate risk management, and a lady stood up at the end. She said, great presentation. She was from the Philippines. But can you just remember, for us, it's not a risk, it's a reality. So, what you say about risk management all makes sense, but what are we doing here? It's already here. It's not just of course, there are uncertainties about how bad it will get, but we're having to deal with it. So I think that was a very potent message. So I think, I've been involved through different groups in this idea of, can we bring insurance, or can we design it in a way that it also becomes a tool suitable for most vulnerable communities? And I think there is still, a big question mark behind that. I think there are really strong and good examples where the communities themselves have come together, have engaged and seen this as a participatory approach, saying, let's understand what the risks are, supported by NGOs, and really sort of community driven. And then I think insurance can play a part, can provide that sort of financial security. But I think what is really dangerous if you walk in and say, well, the problem will be solved with insurance. And, I think fortunately more and more people getting that. And I think what we also see, with the Global Shield Initiative and with the Race to Resilience is really try to hone in, insurance is not a silver bullet. And it might, in many cases, actually, in its current format, not be appropriate for most vulnerable populations. So that puts the onus also on all of us to then think, well, how can we come up with solutions that work for most vulnerable populations?
These are wonderful words for me, because I have never seen insurance really work for large populations of poor people, and this is definitely something we all need to work on. So thank you very much. So are you all prepared with your questions? I'm so sorry, Nate. I keep thinking that you're facilitating everything. But for me, Nate's role and function in the GRP is very, very important and is the reason why I'm playing all these roles. Because I think that the GRP has an amazing ability to bring lots of unusual characters to be together and get to know each other and create relationships of trust. So, over to you.
Thank you, Sheila. And
So sorry.
No, not at all. No, I just wanted to open a couple remarks, and please do have your questions ready. I think that this panel is so powerful because if you go out across the, 100 or 200 events at London Climate Week today, 99% of those are going to be about mitigation. And that's important, right? Getting to net zero is important. But there's this huge gap in funding, in action, and investment going into resilience. And if we go to places in India and we talk about people on the ground, they're not concerned about net zero. They're contributing so little to it. But what they are concerned about is how to thrive in the face of uncertainty, of a really rapidly changing climate. And I think we talk about this funding gap. So by 2050, which is not that far away, it's $565 billion annually needed for adaptation and resilience. We currently spend about $29 billion, and the private sector is tracked adaptation finance is about 2% of that. And I'm pretty sure Craig is about 1.5% of that 2%.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. So this is, what we're seeing, you can see from a litigation perspective, the risks of not doing this. You can see also the opportunities, but it's still, we've got to go so far yet. And this is why, having panels like this and getting people aware of the need for building resilience, because we're locked into, I'm a climate scientist as well, and we're locked into consequences. And I won't go into those because we're all aware of them, but we need to figure out how to manage our livelihoods and nature within a new climate reality. And so this is why this is so important. So I'll pass back to you, Sheila, to the audience.
Okay. So are the people with the mics ready?
Can I
you
just
raise your hand?
say,
Yeah.
comment on one
Yes,
thing?
please do.
Just as an investor in dealing in the global south, in particular, they really, as you're saying, carbon matters, but water matters, food waters. We've seen carbon projects which hurt the community by depriving them of water. So, people want to know they have, in this new climate reality, have food, water. Power is important, but not quite as important. And then protection when a disaster hits. So it's a huge funding gap, but I think it's also a mental gap that we all think now because we're excited about carbon capture technologies and the like, but the fundamental problem on the ground, and water may be number one coming, certainly food, and those are not encapsulated in terms of carbon emissions.
Very important. Can I have some? There's a. And there are two here, so if you have two mics. Yeah, please state your name and something about yourself. So.
Sure. Sahil, I'm a co-founder of a climate risk modeling firm called Tipping Frontier. Curious that although uncertainty brings opportunities, one of the things, especially with finance and capital flows, is that investors and lenders want to be able to price in a risk accurately. So when it comes into elements, say how water security increases conflict risk, or how heat waves increase the likelihood that people risk fail, how much do you think uncertainty creates a challenge when it comes to funding climate adaptation? And what do you think can be done to reduce both actual uncertainty and perception of uncertainty to facilitate greater capital flows for adaptation?
So do you want to direct it to any specific person, or you want them to decide what they want to see?
I'm actually curious on everyone.
Well, the floor is yours. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm happy to start. I think we've come a long way in terms of, it's climate analytics, and, there has been, like well, I wouldn't call it a revolution, but, there has been a significant development of better tools to also allow us to unpack uncertainty. I think what we're less good at, the science community, so I also have a role in the science community, is that the translating and also enabling people to work with uncertainties. So there are sort of two things. You either completely dismiss them and ignore them, or you get so scared because of the uncertainties that you don't take action. And both are not good, and both, I think, have been holding us back in the climate space. So I think the key is not to make uncertainty a stumbling block, but to just say, look, I mean, a lot of things are uncertain. I mean, I sometimes get really annoyed that, with climate change, people home in on the uncertainty, and then I challenge them and say, well, give me another area where, look at AI, look at, other development areas. How certain are you what's going to happen in the next 5-10 years? So I think that argument, we'll also have to challenge it. But at the same time, I know from investors and also from an underwriting perspective, we need to find ways of, incorporating this into our models. And I think it is starting to happen. And I work a lot on this return on investment for adaptation. And, I think sometimes, the right balance between pragmatism and really detailed assessment is hopefully the way forward. But yeah, I think, let's also not over-admire the uncertainty.
What you're also saying is that the whole idea of insurance began by mining what questions you need to ask and how do you produce support, and why can't we go back to that instead of saying there's more uncertainty, because it's another kind of uncertainty, isn't it? Or is that the wrong perspective?
Well, I mean, insurance is based on this concept of, risk and a chance, so that something will happen. We don't know exactly when. We don't know. We have a lot of information. Often it's backwards-looking information, and that's the challenge with climate change. We always, the past isn't a good guide for what's to come. I think my biggest challenge is that people tend to look at climate change as a linear trend.
Yes.
And when you look into some of these models and you do your scenario analysis, it is quite easy to fall into that trap. And I think that's a big danger because, the climate is not behaving in any way or form in a linear way. And these surprises, how often do we hear that people are surprised about, the extent or the scale of an event or the extent of a heat wave? Well, that is climate change. I mean, we're meant, it's not linear. So I think that's a really important part. But that's also, again, makes it challenging for those who are used to looking at more linear trends.
Very interesting. There are two hands here.
Good morning. This is Satish Ramchandani. I'm a founder with Adapt. It's an ESG technology company, earlier with S&P Ratings and Bank of America. So yeah, I just heard some comments, and we all know the kind of investments or the efforts which countries and organizations are making towards the net zero goals. But yet they have a profit objective. They need to answer to the investors and board and other stakeholders, right? So just wanted to have some views in terms of how significant and how rapidly the intermediaries like the insurance companies and the banks and the rating agencies are moving towards a pricing impact on the businesses, right? In terms of, say, higher premiums or lower premiums, or higher rates of interest or lower rates of interest. Because the moment you see a P&L or a balance sheet impact, you tend to see private businesses, acting a little faster, right? Because they have various goals to manage. So happy to have those views.
Who would like to answer that?
Yeah, maybe I can start. It's really interesting because you were talking about rating agencies. I think they are learning as well because if you look at the ratings, for example, for countries and also companies, but companies don't disclose that much, they are not taking into account AR action yet. So countries are rated worse than they should be because the AR actions they take or will take in the future should be taken into account. So I think that's an example of also intermediate players learning and adapting the tools they have. And when it comes to single companies, as I said, when I work with them, first statement is we are prepared. And second question is how precise is what you do? And I said, well, it's more precise than the situation without doing it, because I think you need to start somewhere and then you learn. Is it perfect? I wouldn't say no. I think we're not there yet. But with transition and mitigation, we're not there yet either. So it's a process. And I think we need to start working on that in single institutions, each institution for themselves, but also as a group together, because we need to learn. And companies telling me, yeah, we wait for tools to become more precise or solutions to become better. I think they're losing out, because apart from risks and being compliant and serving rating agencies, there's also huge business potential there. It will change business models. If they really think about AR and the potential that lies behind it, there's lots of business for companies to engage and contribute, yeah, to the good cause of becoming more resilient.
So it reminds me what Gonzalo said before in many of the other discussions which we have. We always calculate the consequences of what already happened, but we don't calculate the consequences of not acknowledging the potential destruction and damage that will happen because we don't make that choice. We don't have the metrics to calculate that, but that's going to be the basis of whether you survive this process as businesses or not. You wanted to say something?
Well, I think the new certainty is uncertainty,
Yes.
and we're not going to be able to quantify it. We know we can all tell different horror stories about what will happen. None of the companies are really prepared. Governments are not prepared. But we do have to start going. What's happening, I think, in some of what we do, there are some insurance companies trying, learning, pushing the envelope to, in some cases, Caribbean islands, doing very creative insurance. There are public-private partnerships which are ahead in terms of philanthropy or grants, creating instruments to try to price risk. I think we have to start, because things are going to happen, and to just ignore it's not going to make sense. But there is it's hard for a lot of people to get their arms around it because it is so uncertain. And in many ways, as Annika is saying, and Sheila said, it's going to be fundamental change. I mean, supply chains, we were talking about, Annika and I, about a major food company. All of its supply for its #1 product are in drought areas. How are they going to survive? They don't have an answer today.
Yeah.
They need one.
Which was the second hand up here? Yes. And then just keep an eye on who put up their hands next. I'm getting so busy listening to what they're saying.
Yeah, Sean Watson from Mountain Hazelnuts Bhutan. We're creating a value chain with vulnerable communities in the Himalayas, and I wanted to share a case study essentially on some of the uncertainties we've experienced. We got hit by a double whammy. Essentially, COVID locked down the country, and we're in a development phase, and obviously missed milestones, and the lack of understanding of our position. And then secondly, one of our main varieties got hit by faster than expected climate change, so warmer winters, and we were looking at having to do a big adaptation program. So grafting over new varieties over 4,000 acres with 8,000 growers. And there was very little understanding when you go to the market that you have a problem. People don't want problems. And whilst there is adaptation money out there, it's generally pretty bureaucratic and doesn't actually reach you in time. We managed to scramble and get through most of this problem. And because of it, we've now trained up hundreds of grafters in Bhutan who can now use this technique to modify other tree crops as climate change comes into effect. In terms of areas of focus, I think more emphasis, I know there is emphasis, but on ability to sort of R&D for germplasm and seeds, and then the methods to actually to change some of these varieties. I think the gap that we identified is there isn't enough market understanding of these risks, and when a problem does happen, how do you actually get access to funds? So those were my comments, really, but it's just how do we actually improve the market understanding of these risks? First for the future, but also when it's actually happening, and how do we get a sticky plaster on it? That's my question.
So since you come from Bhutan, I just wanted to say that I got introduced to the least developed countries program when Bhutan had the presidency, and I learned a lot from that. And as a neighbor of Bhutan in India, we understand that innovative things don't come easily. But I also wanted to bring out here something which is not to do with profit and business. But the king of Bhutan brought this thing called the happiness index. And I remember many years ago, the Physician General of the United States at a meeting 15 years ago said that more people are going to die primarily from depression and mental problems because the food that we are eating, our lifestyle, is producing more mental illnesses that we can account for. And so while we talk about the physical and the challenges of climate change, it is also producing tremendous anxiety and crisis across the world. And so I think this is one of the things we all have to have at the back of our minds to say, what do we need to produce a community of practice that sorts this out? So I just wanted to flag that. Sometimes when we talk about money and business, we forget about our well-being.
Yeah, if I could just ping off that. So Sean, I appreciate that comment, and I've known Sean and his journey with Mountain Hazelnuts for quite a while, and it's pretty amazing that you've been able to recover, but a lot of businesses won't, and that speaks to that funding gap, and just really the challenge that I see when I see London Climate Week, and again, not to detract from the need for mitigation, but we need more attention, investment, action on adaptation and resilience. And just to also build off of Sheila's point, it's this climate anxiety. You know, I've got a young son, and probably many of you have children or your aunts or uncles, and it's really affecting the youth in really profound ways. And I think for me, resilience offers hope, and because it's that innovation that Craig talks about, that Svenja talks about, and also the challenge to the authority that Annika and Nigel talk about as well, and working with businesses, and that is really that transformation side of resilience, where you find those novel ways of stewarding ecosystems, those novel ways of creating livelihoods. That's the real hope. And we use arts a lot within the Resilience Hub, but also within GRP to communicate. And we had a great session here last night with A.Y. Young, who's the SDG ambassador from the US. And really just the power of music and the power of arts to really help ease some of this anxiety, to communicate across channels, but also the power of resilience to really offer hope within the climate space for people. Because when you talk about climate change, resilience and adaptation is where it gets to the people, and that's what I'm here.
Just briefly on that, I think the whole idea of narrative is really important. I mean, that's a bit of the challenge with resilience. It doesn't look very attractive on the outside. Once you start talking about it just as a way to protect you from disaster, but that is not, resilience is, there's so many co-benefits,
proactive.
And it is, being proactive and taking, also making sure that your development ambitions are not derailed by whatever is coming up. So there are lots of co-benefits, and I think that's the challenge. And we're trying very hard to try and turn that into an investable proposition, because that opens up a lot of avenues. So I think it works both ways, also the motivation for resilience, basically.
I'm just chipping in, following on from that. This is where the industry, if it innovates, it can flip things around, yeah. Because one really great example, there's a startup working with tea farmers in India, and they had developed an app which would give them advanced weather forecasting. This insurance that they were offering, traditional insurance, of course, if the rains fail and the crops don't grow, then ultimately you get paid out, you get compensated. This said, no, that's not the model we want. If the long-term forecast shows the rains are likely to fail during the rain window needed for the crop, it pays out straight away. It pays out a fixed sum. You know you're going to get this amount of money. I said, oh, well, it's because I'm coming from an old-style insurance thinking, so that means you could get paid out, and in fact, you cope, the crops grow. He said, that's precisely the point. It pays out so that, for example, you could buy in water and save the crop. And of course, it's the behavior change you then can get based on that. If you know that if this bad thing happens, I will be able to cope, you might invest more. You've got that confidence. Instead of adopting a coping strategy, I'd better put some money aside just in case. You perhaps more front foot.
So just two quick comments on what Sean said. Money is important, but sometimes money can be to do things. One of the things we've been working on with UNDP, which is lots of information in ECO, which is the Inter-American Ag Cooperative, is to get farmer groups to talk to each other and deal with the lack of communication where people are faced with crop failures, with changing climate, with different varieties. I think, again, it's not as sexy as pulling carbon out of the air, but to share that information on resilience. So we're working on, again, digitizing UNDP, but setting up a network so you'd be able to talk to someone who maybe had the same problem or share now your example. And there's some wonderful models out there. The second thing I think on the hope point is resilience training. And with almost digitals everywhere, I think there's such a need to communicate to people, whether kids, parents. So I think that's white space in the climate area, to work with local communities, educating them about what it means and what they can do.
Yeah,
You've created lots of noise here.
And just maybe add one example, really share information, collaborate. I was at a coastal area in the North Sea country, and I had two dedicated groups working on sustainability and resilience measures. One group that was really looking at biodiversity, and the other one working on adaptation and resilience, and they were not aligned. And they were doing stuff that hindered the biodiversity group, did great stuff for biodiversity, but it really hampered AR. And the AR group did great stuff on AR, but it hampered biodiversity. And I said, why don't you sit together and discuss priorities and align on that? And so I think it's so important that people know, that people are informed and understand, and then sit together. And it's a challenging process to sit together and discuss, but in the end, we only find sustainable solutions if we do this.
So we need a lot of negotiators here, I think, rather than champions, because I think lots of people who don't talk to each other have to be facilitated to talk to each other, to move from collaboration to collaboration, to sharing, and things like that. I'm going to break the system, and yes, I want some women. Yesterday we had Gonzalo who said 2 men, 2 women, and I remembered that.
Well, I've got one quick comment.
Okay.
So just to respond to the communication. So actually our problem was solved by working with growers in the Republic of Georgia, and they actually provided the varietal material we needed to fix the problem in Bhutan. And they could have thought of this as a competitive thing, but they saw it as a cooperative thing. We're all trying to fix problems together. And that's an example that points to that.
Thank you. Yes?
Sorry, I just wanted to, in your response to the psychological resilience piece, just to let you know, there is a new network called COP2, which has been formed, which is basically more with a mental health lens, but very much they're pushing the agenda, and I think they will be at the next COP on around actually the psychological resilience around climate, so just to make people aware of that.
This lady here put up her hand, so. No, you didn't?
But I don't mind asking.
Yeah, no, one sec, somebody needs to get you the mic. Sorry, guys. Yeah, please take the mic.
Hi. This discussion is really interesting, and I'm curious about sort of, you've talked about how mitigation, especially during this Climate Action Week, is getting so much more attention, a lot of focus in general when you talk about climate change. How can those of us working in the adaptation field bring more attention to this? I mean, these panels are obviously one way of bringing together different stakeholders to discuss, but do you see sort of there being more of a global coalitions or examples you want to share maybe at COP that would bring more similar attention that mitigation is getting?
Sure, I can take that one first, but we welcome other thoughts. But so years ago, we realized that resilience was sort of everywhere at the COP, but nowhere in particular. And so we set up with others the Resilience Hub at the COP. And that's turned into just this hub of buzzing activity where we have 10,000 plus people coming through and youth activists. We pair it with the youth pavilion. Sheila's a big part of it as well. And it just really brings together the community and opportunities to really push people, not just to talk about resilience, but actually to commit to action. And I think that's what is really key. From our perspective, the Global Resilience Partnership, I mean, we approach this in lots of different ways, but another key area that we're working on is really trying to flip the risk perception of investing in adaptation and resilience. And so when we're working with projects on the ground, like in Sudan or northern Uganda or Mali, you know, the lending that those entrepreneurs and those, like in Sudan, we have a great project on Arabic gum with the Near East Foundation. And their options for getting capital are, they're exposed to rates of around 150 to 200% for loans. But their default rates on the loans are like 6%. And default rates on UK credit cards are about 17%. You know, this is a really good investment case, but you just have to be able to bring people in and show that, you know, there's real opportunity for investing in adaptation and resilience as well. And I think that's what we're working on as well, is really demonstrating that this is an opportunity, and there's people who are just doing wonderful things on the ground and really trying to flip that risk perception.
And maybe adding to what you said, last year COP27 actually worked on the Sharm adaptation agenda. We supported this from BCG, and I think that gives a proper frame for the first time to coordinate and discuss under this umbrella. It's just the beginning, of course, and it needs to be filled with life now, but I think it makes it easier, as you said, to coordinate all the actions that are taking place, all these great actions that are taking place. So just to adding that.
Just in terms of practical things, we need strong metrics on adaptation. You know, we don't, well, we have some, but, you know, they are difficult. And then I think we also need to make sure that adaptation gets added to infrastructure investment, to a lot of other investment, because, you know, while we're having this amazing panel discussion, I guarantee you there are a lot of projects getting signed off which, you know, might do lots of good things, but they haven't really considered resilience and adaptation. And that should really be, you know, a low-hanging fruit, I think.
You know, I think another change that is happening and is the voice of folks like Mia Motley being so strong at COP and other places, and just recently in France. It's there. So I think there is much more of a willingness to talk about survival and things like loss and damage. So I do think that is more a part of the dialogue. Still the challenges, they talked about getting people to invest, but there was movement last week in Paris at the summit beginning to like take out disaster clauses in loan documents in terms of paying things back. So I think that there is a fundamental shift that's happened really due to the leadership of one amazing woman, which also says what a lot of us could follow.
And just to touch on the point on metrics, so we're also part of the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda as well, and leading on the resilience, or helping to co-lead on the resilience of that. But on the metrics, so just last week we brought together 1,000 people online, 200 people in person, from 140 different organizations on resilience, evidence, and measurement in Cape Town. And so we're really pushing on that front as well. That, if we had tried to organize that, you know, 5 years ago, we might have had 10 people in the room. And we were turning people away in person, and it exploded online. So it is really changing. And for me, you know, with the Global Resilience Partnership, I've seen this massive shift in the last 3 years, where when we first started in resilience, the only people from the private sector we could talk to were insurance companies. in resilience because they could see what was coming. And now we have agreements with Google, Microsoft, Meta. We're working with Pegasus. We're running the Prepare call to action for the private sector. It's just really blowing up in very positive ways. So that's exciting.
Sorry, I have the mic.
Yourself. Oh, okay. You're next.
Okay. My name is Muriel, and I work on a different Pegasus. That is a South African company that works with governments and, among a lot of other things, on climate resilience planning. So I guess my question to you guys is, there's been a lot of change on the narrative and bringing in more climate adaptation and resilience for the global south, but that hasn't represented itself on more funding into this. So from a government standpoint, where you guys think that global south government should be doing to be able to kind of bring in more investment, acknowledging that the return on investment narrative on climate adaptation and resilience, it's a little bit challenging, particularly on governments in sub-Saharan Africa, which are going to be the most impacted by climate. So I was just curious about like, what can governments do for the private sector, or how can we bring in more money at the end of the day?
So I do think my reference, I mean, the Bridgetown Initiative is really powerful. And what's interesting is the coalition of, I mean, I assume most of you are familiar with it, started by Mia Motley, but also with very interesting partnerships with the French government, a number of African states, as well as major foundations like Rockefeller, who are real thought leaders, Soros is Open Society. So I think governments embracing that, again, there's a powerful voice that wasn't there, which at least what happened to Sharm el-Sheikh and loss and damage may not have been much, but at least it was a concept that was agreed to. Funding it and applying it's different. So I think people need to join in on that. It's there, and really amplify the message. There was decent attendance in Paris, and it maybe shouldn't have even been held because it's a one-off event. But I think there's a moment now where people can galvanize around that, I think. The second comment I just make is around returns as an investor. There are some sectors of adaptation, it's really hard to find returns, but things like food, things like dealing with sustainable fishing, providing emergency power to people, to small businesses, they're great credits. I mean, there are plenty, and I think one of the things we need to do is amplify. That's why, you know, our Fonio transaction is a great economic transaction. And we have one key thing, we need an off-taker. But we have two major off-takers, European off-takers, so we can support the local market. So, and it's not easy, but I think there are plenty, cold storage is another area we're investing, which is needed throughout Africa, many other places. It's a great business model. So I think there are some areas, there may be no payback where we're going to need more philanthropy. I mean, if you're going to construct a giant seawall to prevent sea rise, that may have to be governmental or philanthropic money. But there are examples. I mean, we're really excited about the investment opportunities. So I think we need to tell those stories, amplify them, and sort of change the mindset.
How would the change of metrics that she talked about, because very often the gains are in something else. And if you quantify that and you look at ways of incentivizing that, then people from the industry can come together. So for fishing, for instance, you know, a lot of people who are, I work with a friend who deals with traditional fisherfolk who have lost out to the big companies, but are the main protectors of the breeding areas. Now, how do you support that kind of thing if you're in the fishing industry? It's also a way of looking at what aggregation you can do to protect the basis of your industry in an ecologically sensitive way. Would that be something sensible to do?
Well, I mean, I think this is an interesting example where you could see also the systemic role that adaptation has. So, you know, in that particular case, you know, the way you were describing it, I could imagine that there could be a way of seeing this as an opportunity for the whole industry to basically come together and look what are the systemic challenges and how can we fund that. And I think there are some examples of how this is starting to happen, also with a broader sustainability perspective. I mean, I think particularly on supply chains, we see that more and more companies are really working hard across the whole supply chain and across, all the way to, the local community that serves, all the things that flow through the supply chain. So I think there are opportunities for that. I think it's getting some clarity on, what the effectiveness is and the impact. I think often people say, well, if you promise me that will have an impact, yes, I'm happy to do it. And I think that's probably the part where...
Since you're also an educator, how much change in the, like business school models? Everybody talks about the Chicago school economic model. So how much of those economic models have to change to bring climate in the center? Because I don't think it's there right now.
Well, that's a big question, but I think the economics discipline has come a long way, and I can give you the example. I work at the LSE at the Grant and Research Department, and we were set up, 15 years ago, and now we're actually having to fight sort of our stand and saying, well, look, climate is starting to be mainstreamed across, and we see this sort of spreading across different departments. So I think there is a mind shift, but some of the fundamentals, I think this view of externalities and some of the the cost of carbon and so on. I think there needs to be more work on that.
And another thing we're doing at GRP is working with GNAM, the MBA programs of business schools around the world. So Michaela University, University of Cape Town, Oxford, Yale, IMD, and others to actually work with the faculty, first to get resilience and adaptation as part of the case studies that the students learn, and then actually have an internship program with UNDP where we get those students who are going to be the future business leaders into some of our partners and actually understand where the opportunities are. So that's also a really key bit in working with people who are learning business models now to understand this opportunity.
Thank you. Sorry, you're next.
Morning, my name is Leah Garden. I'm a climate tech reporter at GreenBiz, based out of the United States. And as I'm sure you know, anti-ESG rhetoric in the United States is loud. And my question is, how much of that is purely noise that comes from media outlets looking for sound bites, because media is, not my media obviously, but other media is a form of entertainment. And so how much of that is just repeating the same old message, and how much of that is actually prevalent in your field with the risks and insurance that you see every day? Is it as big of an issue as the United States is making it seem?
I can, from the insurance angle, unfortunately, it has been consequential. So we had the Net Zero Insurers Alliance that has been gradually disintegrating largely under pressure from the states. Members of that alliance who sign up to 1.5 degrees and the most ambitious of the world's insurers, one by one have been stepping away. And it's the ones who've stepped away are the ones with a big presence in the States. And I think it's this, they've been having extraordinary letters from attorneys general in red states in America. I mean, just blood-curdling threats about what will happen to them if they don't back down. What's happened is that all the insurers who've withdrawn have said, we're withdrawing, but we are not stepping back from our own commitment. It's just that we won't now be publicly part of this forum. It's deeply unfortunate because it's universally agreed outside the red states that you have to have collaboration to make this work. Whole industry collaboration is absolutely essential to tackle not just climate change, biodiversity crisis, the water crisis and so on. And so this is very negative pressure. But it's also the rhetoric around it, is the anti-woke, so it's the best keep your head down is becoming, and green hushing is coming about as well. Companies are saying a lot less now about what they're trying to achieve. I haven't yet seen pulling back of ambition of the more ambitious companies, but it is unfortunate. And of course, I assume if they succeed with the NZIA, they will then move on to the banking, asset owners, and so on. So yeah, it is real, I'm afraid.
I've been given a signal that it's time up. And I hope all of you will forgive me for breaching the written down standard way of talking to all of you. But I have learned a lot today, and I think that each one of us has to amplify these messages and dig deep into transforming the fundamentals of the knowledge on the basis of which we make choices, because the choices have to not only be responsible for what you do yourself, but the impact of that on the rest of the world. So in many ways, this discussion makes all of us, in a way, activists to that transformation, including what you were saying. You know, how do you navigate resentment, deep aggression, a lot of angst and fears that people bring in? And I think that more discussions like this between very different people produces a robust response to what we have all to do. So thank you very much. I hope you take back some positive possibilities and some new networks to engage with. So thank you very much.